You found the Stealth Podcast. Where are you watching from? What time is it there? Subscribe and comment to support us. Thanks. Let's begin. I'm nomad living in my converted Ford Transit, trading my old accounting life for freelance data analysis on the road. 2 years of wandering led me to Valentine, Nebraska, where the Niobrara River's beauty hid a sinister secret. A local's offer to camp on private land seemed kind, but strange nighttime visitors, a sabotaged van, and whispers of a deadly Connors-Mercer feud pulled me into a chilling conspiracy. What I found in a riverside shed changed everything, but some truths about Valentine remained buried. My name is Ellis Harrow. I'm 34 years old, and I've been living in my converted Ford Transit for about 2 years now. After quitting my accounting job in Kansas City, I decided to embrace the nomadic lifestyle, working remotely as a freelance data analyst. The freedom was intoxicating at first, waking up to different views, meeting interesting people, and documenting everything on my low-traffic blog. Little did I know that my wanderlust would lead me to the disturbing events that unfolded in Valentine, Nebraska. It was late September when I arrived in Valentine, a small town nestled along the Niobrara River. The autumn colors were just beginning to emerge, painting the landscape in warm hues that contrasted sharply with the increasingly cold nights. I'd planned to stay just a few days to photograph the scenic riverways and maybe do some hiking in the nearby nature preserve. The town seemed peaceful enough. Quaint storefronts, friendly waves from locals at the general store, and a surprisingly good coffee shop where I set up my laptop on that first morning. That's where I met Liam Connors, a weathered-looking man in his 50s with calloused hands and intense gray eyes that seemed to catalog my every movement. He struck up a conversation casually enough, curious about my van life setup and where I traveled. He mentioned he was the caretaker for several properties around town, including some vacant land near the river that offered spectacular views, where I could park for a few days undisturbed. It's private property, but I manage it, and the owners won't be back until spring, he explained, sketching a crude map on a napkin. Much better than the Walmart parking lot, and no one will bother you there. I should have noticed the strange looks exchanged between the barista and another local when Liam made this offer. A slight widening of the eyes, a barely perceptible shake of the head. But I was too focused on the prospect of a scenic, free camping spot to pay attention to these subtle warnings. Besides, Liam seemed genuinely helpful, and I'd met plenty of kind locals during my travels who were happy to share the hidden gems of their communities with passing nomads like me. So I thanked him for the tip and decided to check out the spot that evening, a decision I would come to regret with every fiber of my being. Following Liam's directions, I navigated my van down a series of increasingly narrow dirt roads as dusk settled over the Nebraska countryside. The property was indeed beautiful, a grassy clearing surrounded by cottonwood trees with the Niobrara River visible in the distance. I parked near a dilapidated wooden shed, positioning my solar panels to catch the morning sun. As I was making dinner on my portable stove, I noticed a pickup truck slow down on the distant main road, pause for several seconds, then continue on. Nothing alarming, but something about the deliberate way it stopped made me uneasy. That night, I was awakened by the sound of movement outside my van. Heart pounding, I peered through my blackout curtains to see flashlight beams sweeping across the property. 2 figures were methodically examining the ground around my vehicle, whispering to each other in tones too low for me to make out. I held my breath, terrified they'd try the doors. After what felt like hours, they retreated into the darkness. I didn't sleep again that night, clutching my phone with its barely there signal, wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake coming here. In the harsh light of morning, I tried to rationalize the nighttime visitors, perhaps local police checking on a suspicious vehicle, or maybe just curious teenagers. Still shaken, I decided to head into town for coffee and stronger cell reception to research alternative camping spots. At the coffee shop, I noticed people staring, conversations dying as I entered. The friendly barista from yesterday was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a stern-faced woman who served me without making eye contact. As I sat typing on my laptop, a local newspaper left on the table caught my attention, a small article about property disputes turning violent on the outskirts of town, with a mention of a land inheritance conflict between the Connors and Mercer families. The name Connors made my stomach drop. I quickly gathered my things, planning to leave Valentine immediately, when Sheriff Mercer, the name displayed prominently on his badge, entered the coffee shop and made a beeline for my table. "Mr. Harrow," he said, not a question but a statement. "I understand you're staying on the old Riverwood property. I'd like to have a word with you about trespassing on contested land." His hand rested casually on his holster as he spoke, his eyes cold and evaluating. I realized with creeping horror that I'd unwittingly stepped into the middle of something dangerous, a local feud where outsiders like me were potential pawns in a game I didn't understand. Sheriff Mercer escorted me to the police station, a small brick building with just 3 desks in the main area. His questions seemed routine at first: how I knew Liam, why I came to Valentine, how long I planned to stay. But the underlying tension was palpable. "That property you're on," he said, leaning forward, "has been tied up in court for 15 years. Liam Connors has no right to let anyone stay there." He slid a document across the desk, a restraining order against Liam, barring him from the very property he directed me to. "The Connors family has been trying to force the sale of that land for years. Having you there, a supposed invited guest, is just their latest tactic." I was released with a warning to leave town, but my van keys were mysteriously misplaced during processing, requiring me to walk back to the coffee shop where I'd left my vehicle. As I walked, a red pickup slowed beside me. Liam Connors at the wheel, his earlier friendliness replaced with barely contained rage. "You talked to Mercer," he spat, "after I helped you." I tried explaining I'd been brought in against my will, but he wasn't listening. "We had an understanding. You were supposed to stay put." The implication that I was meant to serve some purpose in his scheme sent chills down my spine. Before I could respond, he accelerated away, but not before warning, "You've picked your side now." Back at my van, I found a note tucked under the windshield wiper: "Leave or suffer the consequences." Hands shaking, I started the engine, planning to get far away from Valentine and its disturbing residents. But my relief was short-lived. The engine sputtered and died after just a few blocks. When I popped the hood, I discovered that several wires had been cut and a vital component removed. I was stranded in a hostile town, caught between warring factions. Night was falling fast as I called the only mechanic in Valentine, who apologetically informed me that parts would take at least 2 days to arrive. With no choice, I checked into the only motel in town, a dingy place with paper-thin walls and flickering lights. That night, persistent knocking at my door drove me to peek through the curtains, where I saw not a person, but a small cardboard box. After the knocking stopped and the hallway remained empty for several minutes, I cautiously retrieved it. Inside was a bloody spark plug, unmistakably from my van, wrapped in a property deed with both the Connors and Mercer names on it, portions highlighted to show land divisions. A handwritten note read, "Evidence against the sheriff is in the shed where you parked. Retrieve it by midnight, or your van won't be all that gets dismantled." I realized with growing dread that I wasn't just caught in their feud. I was being coerced into becoming an active participant in a decades-old blood dispute, with my life hanging in the balance. With few options and time ticking toward midnight, I made a desperate plan. Using the motel's ancient computer, I researched the property dispute, discovering that 3 people had gone missing in connection with the case over the years, all outsiders who had briefly stayed in Valentine. Local forum posts hinted that evidence of foul play had been covered up by both families operating in complex, tacit cooperation despite their public feud. I realized I needed to escape, but without my van, I'd have to be creative. I called a rideshare service from the next town over, offering triple the fare for a late-night pickup, before stealthily leaving the motel through the bathroom window to avoid the front desk clerk, who I'd noticed making frequent calls after checking me in. The rideshare was still 40 minutes away, so I decided to take a calculated risk. I'd go to the shed, not to retrieve whatever evidence they wanted me to find, but to gather anything that might help me understand what I'd stumbled into. Using back alleys and keeping to shadows, I made my way out of town toward the property. The night was moonless, which helped conceal my approach, but also made navigating the unfamiliar terrain treacherous. Twice I froze at the sound of vehicles on the main road, pressing myself against trees until they passed. When I finally reached the shed, I used my phone's flashlight, keeping it pointed downward to minimize the chance of being spotted. What I found inside the decrepit structure turned my blood to ice. Maps of the property with X marks at various locations, dates spanning decades, and photos of people I didn't recognize alongside receipts for industrial quantities of quicklime. In a metal box, hidden beneath loose floorboards were documents revealing that both the Mercers and Connors had been working together to acquire land parcels from deceased owners with no heirs. Deaths that coincided suspiciously with visits from out-of-towners. With shaking hands, I photographed everything, then heard the unmistakable sound of tires on gravel. Through a crack in the wall, I saw two vehicles approaching, Sheriff Mercer's cruiser and Liam's red pickup, converging on the shed where I was hiding. With no back door and the vehicles blocking the only path back to town, I squeezed through a broken window, cutting my arm badly on the glass. Blood dripping down my sleeve, I ran toward the river, hoping the rushing water would mask my sounds and provide a path to safety. Behind me, flashlights swept the field as voices called out with false concern. "Mr. Harrow? Are you out here? We're worried about you." The friendly facades had dropped completely. These were predators tracking prey. I stumbled down the riverbank, half sliding through mud, when a spotlight caught me from across the water. More voices, more vehicles. The trap was closing. In desperation, I plunged into the frigid Niobrara River, letting the current carry me downstream, while keeping my phone sealed in its waterproof case above the surface. The shocking cold numbed my cut arm, but also cleared my head. As I drifted away from my pursuers, I realized Valentine's dark secret was far worse than a simple land dispute. I'd uncovered a decades-long conspiracy of systematic murder, with both families eliminating visitors to gradually acquire the surrounding properties. The river carried me nearly 2 miles downstream before I managed to drag myself onto the bank, shivering violently and dangerously close to hypothermia. My rideshare had been texting frantically. He'd arrived at our meeting point, but couldn't find me. Using my remaining battery, I sent him my GPS coordinates with a desperate plea to come quickly and bring blankets. Miraculously, he responded that he was on his way, having taken a rural access road that ran parallel to the river. As headlights appeared in the distance, I nearly wept with relief, only to feel crushing horror as a sheriff's cruiser pulled up instead of the rideshare car I was expecting. Sheriff Mercer stepped out, his expression almost sad as he approached my trembling form. "You shouldn't have gone snooping, Mr. Harrow. Outsiders like you never understand. This land, it's our birthright. Our families have protected it for generations." As he reached for his sidearm, headlights appeared behind him. My actual rideshare driver had arrived. In the momentary confusion, I scrambled toward the approaching vehicle, screaming for help. The driver, a burly man named Keith, jumped out as Mercer raised his weapon. What happened next occurred in a blur. Keith, a former military medic, reacted with trained precision, tackling the sheriff to the ground as I dove into the backseat of his car. Keith's quick thinking saved my life that night, but the nightmare wasn't over. As we sped toward the state line, I transferred the damning photos to his phone and instructed him to send them to the Nebraska State Police once we were safely away. We were forced to detour repeatedly as we spotted roadblocks on the main highways. The Mercers' influence apparently extended to neighboring towns. It was nearly dawn when we finally reached South Dakota, where Keith took me directly to a hospital for my hypothermia and lacerated arm. While doctors treated me, state troopers took my statement, viewing the evidence with increasing alarm. The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Valentine's horrific secret. 17 visitors had disappeared over 20 years, their vehicles and possessions conveniently abandoned on contested properties that were later acquired through legal loopholes by either the Connors or Mercer families. The conspiracy had tentacles reaching into county records offices, the local courts, and even the regional press, which explained how they'd operated undetected for so long. 6 months later, I testified at the trial that finally brought down both families and their accomplices. My van was eventually recovered and returned to me, though I sold it soon after. The sight of it brought back too many disturbing memories. I've stopped traveling alone now, and I meticulously research every place I visit. But sometimes at night, I still wake up in a cold sweat, imagining flashlight beams searching for me in the darkness, and wondering about the travelers who weren't lucky enough to escape Valentine's deadly property scheme. My name is Rowan Tanner, I'm 28 years old and I live in my renovated Sprinter van after leaving my stressful career as a nurse in Denver. 6 months ago, I traded 12-hour hospital shifts for the open road, supporting myself through travel photography I sell to online publications. It's been refreshing to wake up in new places, though I've learned to be strategic about where I park for the night. But nothing in my van life experience prepared me for what happened in Carhenge, Nebraska. What started as a quirky photo opportunity turned into the most terrifying week of my life. I'd been planning to visit the famous Carhenge Monument outside Alliance for months, a replica of Stonehenge made entirely of vintage American cars. The photos would be perfect for my portfolio. I arrived in the afternoon, the late spring sun casting long shadows across the bizarre sculpture of half-buried, spray-painted vehicles arranged in a perfect circle. A few tourists milled about, snapping pictures and laughing at the strange roadside attraction. I spent hours photographing the monument from every angle, waiting for sunset when the light would transform the odd metal structures into something almost mystical. That's when I met Darian Wells, the caretaker who lived in a small house adjacent to the monument. He approached as I was adjusting my tripod, seemingly interested in my photography. With his salt and pepper beard and weathered face, he looked like he'd seen hard times, but his eyes were kind. "You've got a good eye," he said, glancing at my camera screen. "Most folks just take a quick selfie and leave." We talked about photography and eventually about my nomadic lifestyle. When I mentioned I was looking for a place to park for the night, he offered his driveway. "The local cops are strict about overnight parking, but they won't bother you on private property," he explained. I accepted Darian's offer, partly out of convenience and partly because he seemed genuinely interested in my stories from the road. Over a simple dinner he invited me to share on his porch, he told me about Carhenge's history and the surrounding area. As darkness fell, he mentioned almost casually, "Some locals claim the monument attracts strange energy. Old cattle mutilations, people getting disoriented, losing time. Just silly small-town superstitions, of course." He laughed it off, but something in his tone made me uneasy. Still, I thanked him for his hospitality and retreated to my van, planning to leave after capturing sunrise photos the next morning. I woke before dawn, eager to catch the first light hitting the metal structure. The air was unusually still as I approached Carhenge with my equipment. In the dim pre-dawn light, the monument looked more unsettling than whimsical, jagged silhouettes against the gradually brightening sky. As I set up my tripod, I noticed strange markings in the dirt that hadn't been there the evening before. Intricate circular patterns surrounding the monument, too precise to be random. I initially dismissed them as perhaps something Darian had done for maintenance, though their complexity seemed excessive. While photographing, I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every few minutes, I'd turn abruptly, expecting to find someone standing behind me, but there was never anyone there. Just as the sun crested the horizon, my phone lost signal completely. Strange, since I'd had perfect reception the day before. Then my camera malfunctioned, the screen displaying distorted images before shutting down entirely. I tried removing the battery and reinserting it, but nothing worked. Frustrated and increasingly uncomfortable, I decided to head back to my van and troubleshoot my equipment there. Returning to Darian's property, I found him already awake, drinking coffee on his porch. When I mentioned the camera issues and the strange markings, his expression changed subtly. Concern and something else, perhaps fear, flickered across his face. "Those patterns show up sometimes," he said carefully. "No one knows who makes them." He offered to look at my camera, but declared it beyond his expertise. Then he suggested I stay another night, as a storm was forecast. "The roads get treacherous when it rains," he explained. "You're welcome here until it passes." Though something felt off about his sudden insistence, the darkening clouds on the horizon convinced me to accept. That afternoon, the promised storm arrived with unexpected intensity, thunder that seemed to shake the ground, and lightning striking uncomfortably close to the monument. Through my van window, I watched Darian hurry out to Carhenge in the downpour, seemingly checking something among the cars. Later, when I asked about it over dinner, he avoided my question, instead telling me about local legends. Stories of indigenous rituals performed on the land centuries before the monument was built, and more recent rumors of a cult that believed the monument's metal structure amplified otherworldly communications. "People around here have active imaginations," he said with a forced laugh. That night, despite the storm having passed, my van's electronics began behaving erratically. Lights flickering, my phone cycling on and off, my portable power station draining rapidly despite being fully charged. Something was very wrong with this place, and I was beginning to suspect Darian knew exactly what it was. I barely slept, jolting awake at 3:17 a.m. when my van's lights and fans suddenly turned on by themselves. Through my window, I saw what appeared to be a gathering at Carhenge, several figures moving among the cars, carrying flashlights. Darian was among them, his voice occasionally carrying on the night air, though I couldn't make out the words. Curiosity overcoming fear, I slipped out of my van and crept closer, using the monument's massive structures as cover. The group, about 8 people including Darian, had arranged themselves in a circle within Carhenge, speaking in hushed tones about the signal and the window opening soon. My heart nearly stopped when one of them said, "The outsider's presence has strengthened the connection. Their energy is different, perfect for amplification." I knew instantly they were talking about me. As I backed away, planning to return to my van and leave immediately, my foot dislodged a stone. The small noise might as well have been an explosion in the quiet night. 8 flashlight beams swung in my direction, illuminating me like a deer in headlights. "Rowan," Darian called, his friendly demeanor evaporating. "You should have stayed in your van. Now you'll have to participate." I ran, but 2 group members were faster, cutting off my path back to safety. They weren't violent, but their grip was firm as they escorted me into the circle. Darian explained with disturbing calmness that Carhenge wasn't just an art installation. It was built on a thin spot between dimensions, and the car's metal framework somehow amplified whatever energy existed there. "Every year at spring equinox, the barrier weakens," he said. "We can communicate with the other side, but we need a fresh energy source, someone who hasn't been exposed before." The implications sent terror coursing through me as they positioned me in the center of their circle. What happened next defies rational explanation. As the group began a low, rhythmic chant, the air around Carhenge seemed to thicken and distort. My skin tingled painfully, like static electricity building to unbearable levels. The metal cars began to emit a low humming sound that gradually increased in pitch until it was nearly unbearable. Through tear-filled eyes, I saw what appeared to be the air itself rippling between the structures, occasional flashes revealing glimpses of somewhere else. A landscape both familiar and wrong, like Earth but with colors shifted beyond normal perception. Most disturbing of all, I could see figures moving in that other place, approaching the thinning barrier between our worlds. As one reached toward the rippling air, its elongated fingers seemingly inches from breaking through, I broke free from my captor's now slack grip and ran blindly into the night, their shouts fading behind me. "Stop her. The connection is unstable. It could cross without anchoring." I sprinted across the field, lungs burning and legs threatening to give out at any moment. Behind me, the unnatural humming from Carhenge grew louder, accompanied by what sounded like metal scraping against metal. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The cars comprising the monument appeared to be vibrating, lifting slightly off their foundations. More terrifying were the shadow-like appendages now visibly reaching through the distorted air between the structures, probing into our world like curious tentacles. The cult members were scattered, some pursuing me while others remained at the monument, arms raised as if in welcome to whatever was coming through. With Darian's house between me and my van, I veered toward the main road instead, praying a passing car might help. The rural highway stretched empty in both directions, moonlight illuminating miles of deserted asphalt. In desperation, I ducked into a drainage ditch beside the road, crawling through its murky water to throw off my pursuers. The cold water soaked through my clothes as I army crawled through the concrete tunnel, emerging on the other side of the road. From this vantage point, I could see the entire Carhenge site, and what I saw froze my blood. The air above the monument was now visibly distorted, like heat waves, but more substantial, with what looked like lightning contained within the rippling space. After several terrifying minutes of hiding, I saw headlights approaching, a semi-truck barreling down the highway. I took my chance, scrambling up the embankment and waving frantically. The truck slowed, its air brakes hissing as the driver, a middle-aged woman named Meredith, opened her passenger door. "You okay, honey? You're soaking wet." Before I could form a coherent explanation, shouts from the direction of Carhenge drew her attention. In the truck's side mirror, I could see 3 figures running toward us, Darian in the lead. "Those folks bothering you?" Meredith asked, her expression hardening. When I nodded frantically, she didn't hesitate. She put the truck in gear and accelerated away from Carhenge, CB radio already in hand to report a possible assault to authorities. As we gained distance, my relief was short-lived. The truck's electronics began malfunctioning, dashboard lights flickering, radio cycling through stations, GPS glitching. Most alarmingly, I realized something was following us, a distortion in the air behind the truck that moved faster than any vehicle could. "What on earth?" Meredith muttered, noticing the anomaly in her mirrors. The truck began to slow despite her pressing the accelerator to the floor. "It's like something's dragging us back," she said, panic edging into her voice. Looking back through the rear window, I saw with horror that the distortion had formed tendrils that seemed to be physically grasping the truck, pulling it backward toward Carhenge. More terrifying still, I could now clearly see what lurked within that distortion. Entities that resembled humans in basic structure but were wrong in proportions and movement, their forms flickering between visibility and transparency as they reached for us. The truck skidded to a complete stop on the highway, its engine revving futilely against the invisible force pulling us backward. "Run!" Meredith shouted, already unbuckling her seatbelt. "I'll be right behind you." I hesitated for only a second before throwing open the door and jumping down to the asphalt. Meredith wasn't as lucky. As she attempted to exit from her side, one of the transparent tendrils wrapped around her ankle, dragging her screaming from the cab. I watched in horror as she was pulled rapidly toward the distortion, her body elongating unnaturally as she crossed the threshold between normal space and whatever impossible physics governed the anomaly. With no time to process what I'd witnessed, I ran blindly into a cornfield beside the highway, desperate to put distance between myself and the horror behind me. The stalks whipped at my face as I crashed through row after row, changing direction frequently in hopes of throwing off pursuit. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, I collapsed behind a small tractor shed, my body betraying me with exhaustion. As I fought to control my ragged breathing, I heard something moving through the corn, not the crashing of human pursuers, but a subtle shifting, like wind moving through the stalks, except there was no wind that night. Dawn was breaking when I finally emerged from hiding, having spent the night in terrified vigilance. In the morning light, I could see Carhenge in the distance, looking completely normal, no distortions, no cult members, just a quirky roadside attraction. With trembling legs, I made my way back to the highway, flagging down a state trooper who was, coincidentally, responding to reports of an abandoned semi-truck. When I tried explaining what had happened, the officer's skepticism was obvious. He drove me back to Carhenge to retrieve my van, assuring me he'd investigate my claims about Darian and the cult. But when we arrived, everything had changed. Darian's house was clearly abandoned, with weeds growing through the porch boards and windows boarded up. "This place has been empty for years," the trooper explained, confused by my insistence that I'd stayed there the previous night. At Carhenge itself, a memorial plaque had been added that wasn't there before, dedicated to 8 local residents who disappeared during a meteorological anomaly near the monument 3 years earlier. Darian Wells' name topped the list. My van was where I'd left it, but covered in a layer of dust and pollen that would have taken weeks to accumulate. Inside, I found my journal open to an entry I had no memory of writing, dated 3 weeks after I'd arrived at Carhenge. The handwriting mine, but subtly different, more angular, the letters connecting in ways I never formed them. The entry described how I decided to stay in alliance, having found my purpose with new friends who understand the connection. Most disturbing was the final line. "They say the transition becomes complete after the first cycle. I already feel less attached to my old self, more attuned to what waits on the other side." I showed the journal to the trooper, who radioed for backup after reading it. Tests later revealed that 3 weeks had indeed passed since I'd arrived at Carhenge, though I had no memory of that time. Medical examinations showed subtle anomalies in my cellular structure that doctors couldn't explain. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of that other place in reflective surfaces, that wrongly colored landscape with its impossible inhabitants. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, my movements seem slightly out of sync with my intentions, as if something else is learning to wear my body. I wonder if the real Rowan Tanner ever escaped Carhenge, or if whatever returned in her place is merely a convincing copy, a bridge between worlds that's still being crossed. My name is Nolan Vega. I'm 31 years old and originally from Portland, Oregon. After 5 years working as an environmental consultant, I quit my job when the company started approving projects I found ethically questionable. With my savings and a newly converted 1978 Volkswagen bus I spent 6 months restoring, I set out to document America's forgotten environmental disasters, the contaminated sites that never made national headlines but continue to affect local communities. My plan was to create a video series that might generate enough views to raise awareness and maybe earn me a modest income through sponsorships. That mission led me to Ord, Nebraska, a small farming community in Valley County with rumors of unexplained livestock deaths and contaminated groundwater. I'd been on the road for almost 4 months when I arrived in Ord, my VW bus, affectionately named Kermit for its faded green paint, loaded with water testing equipment, cameras, and just enough living essentials to keep me comfortable. The town itself was what you'd expect, a main street with faded storefronts, grain silos visible on the horizon, and locals who immediately identified me as an outsider. My first stop was the local diner, where I hoped to strike up conversations about the environmental concerns I'd read about online. The waitress, Maggie, was friendly enough, bringing me extra coffee without my asking, but grew visibly uncomfortable when I mentioned the livestock deaths. "We don't talk much about that," she said, glancing around to see if anyone had overheard. "But if you're really interested, you should talk to Harlan Pierce. He lost half his herd 3 years ago." She scribbled an address on my receipt, then added, "Just don't mention you heard it from me, and whatever you do, stay away from the old munitions plant north of town. That place isn't right." Her warning might have seemed melodramatic if not for the genuine fear in her eyes. I thanked her and headed out to find Harlan Pierce, excited to have a lead, but unaware that my investigation would uncover something far more disturbing than agricultural pollution, a secret that the people of Ord had been keeping buried since World War II. Harlan's farm was about 15 minutes outside of town, a modest operation with fields of corn stretching to the horizon and a small pasture where healthy-looking cattle grazed. The man himself was tall and weathered, with hands like leather and eyes that had seen too much hardship. At first, he was reluctant to talk, especially when I mentioned recording our conversation for my documentary. But when I explained my background in environmental science and my genuine concern for the community, something in him seemed to give way. "You can't use my name," he insisted, before inviting me inside his kitchen. There, over bitter coffee, he told me about the night half his cattle died, how they'd been found twisted in unnatural positions, their bodies contorted as if in tremendous pain, with no visible cause of death. The university folks said it was some kind of toxin, he explained, but they couldn't identify it. And the government men who came afterward, they weren't interested in helping, just in making sure nobody asked too many questions. Harlan's story was just the beginning. Over the next few days, I interviewed several locals who shared similar experiences, mysterious crop failures, animals dying in painful contortions, even health problems that seemed concentrated in certain areas outside of town. Most pointed to the abandoned munitions plant as the likely source, though no one had definitive proof. The facility, operational during World War II and the Korean War, had officially been decommissioned in 1963 and supposedly cleaned up by the Army Corps of Engineers. But according to local lore, they'd simply buried the most dangerous materials in unmarked locations around the property. After gathering enough testimonials, I decided it was time to see the plant for myself, despite nearly everyone's warnings to stay away. The perimeter was marked with faded, "No trespassing" signs, the chain-link fence rusted and sagging in places. Finding a gap large enough to slip through wasn't difficult. The facility itself was a collection of concrete buildings overtaken by decades of prairie growth, weeds pushing through cracked foundations, trees growing through collapsed roofs. I spent hours documenting everything, taking soil samples near drainage areas, and mapping what appeared to be unnatural depressions in the ground that could indicate burial sites. As dusk approached, I realized I'd lost track of time. The setting sun cast long shadows across the abandoned complex, creating an increasingly eerie atmosphere. Just as I was packing up my equipment, I heard a vehicle approaching and ducked inside one of the buildings. Through a broken window, I watched a pickup truck stop near the fence line. Two men got out, one in a sheriff's uniform, the other in plain clothes, but with an official-looking clipboard. They weren't patrolling. They appeared to be taking measurements and readings with specialized equipment. Most concerning was their attire. Despite the warm evening, both wore heavy gloves and respirators around their necks, ready to be pulled up at a moment's notice. I managed to record them from my hiding spot, though the fading light made the footage grainy. Their conversation drifted my way in fragments. Levels are higher again. Need to adjust the containment. Can't have another incident like Pierce's farm. When they finally left, darkness had fallen completely. Using my flashlight to navigate back to the fence, I noticed something unsettling. Small patches of vegetation that glowed with a faint bluish luminescence when my light passed over them. Curious and concerned, I took samples, careful not to touch the plants directly. Back at my bus, which I'd parked on an unused service road near the facility, I examined the samples with my portable microscope. The cellular structure was unlike anything I'd seen before. Plant cells that appeared to be housing some kind of crystalline structures that reflected light in unusual ways. That night, I was awakened by a sharp pain in my hand, the same hand I'd used to collect the samples, despite wearing gloves. The skin was red and inflamed, with small blisters forming along my fingers. More alarming was the faint glow visible in the darkness, emanating from the afflicted areas. I immediately washed my hand in every solution I had available, from soap to rubbing alcohol, but the burning sensation only intensified. Sleep became impossible as I researched radiation exposure and chemical burns on my laptop, becoming increasingly convinced that whatever contaminated the munitions plant was far more dangerous and unusual than conventional pollution. Morning brought no relief. The rash had spread up my arm, the skin now tight and shiny with an almost metallic hue in direct sunlight. More concerning were the small, hard nodules forming beneath the surface, like embedded grains of sand that shifted slightly when pressed. Unable to ignore the worsening symptoms, I drove into town to find a doctor, parking my distinctive VW bus behind the medical clinic to avoid attention. The young physician, Dr. Abernathy, took one look at my arm and her expression changed from professional concern to barely concealed fear. "Where exactly have you been since arriving in Ord?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Before I could answer, she closed the examination room door and spoke in a near whisper. "You went to the plant, didn't you?" When I nodded, she closed her eyes briefly as if steeling herself for an unpleasant task. "I need to make a call. Stay here." She left me alone for nearly 15 minutes, returning with an older man she introduced as Dr. Holcomb, a specialist who'd been with the clinic for decades. His examination was thorough and silent, his frown deepening as he studied the nodules under my skin. Finally, he asked a nurse to prepare an injection. "This will help with the inflammation," he explained, though something in his tone made me instantly wary. Trusting my instincts, I declined the injection and insisted on knowing exactly what was happening to me. The confrontation that followed confirmed my suspicions. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to contain a situation. "Whatever you've been exposed to needs to be neutralized," Dr. Holcomb said, his demeanor shifting from medical professional to authoritarian figure. "This isn't just about you. The contaminant is active, it spreads." When I demanded more information, mentioning my environmental background and threatening to contact state authorities, the doctor's face hardened. "You think you're the first outsider to discover this? There's a reason the state environmental office never responds to complaints from Ord." I left the clinic without treatment, increasingly convinced I'd stumbled upon a cover-up extending beyond local officials. Back in my bus, I examined the nodules more closely with my microscope and was horrified to discover they were growing, the crystalline structures multiplying beneath my skin. More disturbing was their behavior. When extracted with sterilized tweezers, the tiny formations moved independently, orienting themselves like compass needles toward the direction of the munitions plant. The implications were too bizarre to fully process, but I knew I needed more information before I could seek proper help. That evening, as I was reviewing my research notes, a sharp knock on my bus door startled me. Outside stood Sheriff Hayes, one of the men I'd observed at the plant, flanked by 2 deputies. "Mr. Vega," he said, his tone falsely pleasant, "we need you to come with us. Dr. Holcomb informed us of your condition, and we have a specialist from Lincoln who can help." The obvious lie might have been convincing if I hadn't seen him at the plant, taking readings in protective gear. When I refused to open the door, his demeanor changed instantly. "We can do this voluntarily, or we can quarantine your vehicle and escort you by force. Your condition poses a public health risk." I had seconds to make a decision. Through the curtained windows of my bus, I could see the deputies positioning themselves around my vehicle. The sheriff's hand rested on his holster, an implicit threat I couldn't ignore. In a desperate move, I started the engine and floored the accelerator, the old VW lurching forward with a mechanical roar that belied its usual gentle purr. I caught a glimpse of the sheriff diving out of the way as I crashed through a wooden fence, cutting across an empty lot toward the highway. The deputies scrambled for their vehicles, but my head start gave me precious minutes. The bus wasn't built for speed, maxing out around 65 miles per hour on flat terrain, but I knew the back roads better than they might expect thanks to my environmental surveys of the area. I headed east, away from town, taking increasingly remote dirt roads until I was deep in farmland with no signs of pursuit. My temporary safety allowed me to assess my situation, which was dire by any standard. The infection or contamination had spread to my shoulder, the skin now displaying web-like patterns with a subtle luminescence visible even in daylight. Worse, I was beginning to feel strange internal effects, a buzzing sensation in my affected limb and occasional moments when it seemed to move without my conscious direction. As night fell, I found an isolated spot to park, hidden by a stand of trees near an abandoned grain silo. Using my remaining medical supplies, I attempted to extract more of the crystalline nodules, collecting them in a sealed specimen container. Under the microscope, their behavior was increasingly alarming. The separated crystals appeared to be communicating somehow, arranging themselves in complex patterns that shifted in unison. More disturbing was their reaction when I brought them near my infected arm. They oriented toward it like iron filings to a magnet, vibrating with increased intensity. Around midnight, my radio turned on by itself, emitting not music but a pattern of static and tones that seemed oddly synchronized with the pulsing sensations in my arm. When I tried to turn it off, the knobs moved back to their original position without my touching them. Then my phone activated, the screen displaying rapidly changing sequences of numbers and symbols I didn't recognize. A terrifying realization dawned. Whatever had infected me was generating electromagnetic effects, manipulating electronics in my vicinity. As if confirming my theory, the specimen container with the extracted crystals began to vibrate violently on the table, the formations inside arranging themselves into a structure that disturbingly resembled a miniature radio tower. By dawn, I knew I couldn't stay in Ord or even Nebraska, not if I wanted answers rather than a cover-up. I needed to reach my former colleague, Dr. Eliza Chun, whose laboratory at the University of Washington specialized in unusual biological chemical interactions. The drive would take at least 15 hours, but it was my only hope for understanding what was happening to me. As I prepared to leave my hiding spot, I noticed smoke rising from the direction of town. Turning on the actual radio news, I heard a bulletin about a chemical fire at a storage facility where a deranged environmental activist had allegedly been squatting. They were describing my previous parking spot, and they created a convenient narrative to explain any contamination that might be found there. The highway seemed like an obvious trap, so I continued on back roads, heading north towards South Dakota where I might find less coordinated law enforcement. The journey was a nightmare of advancing symptoms. By noon, the crystalline structures had spread to my chest, and I experienced moments of lost time where I'd suddenly find myself having driven miles with no memory of doing so. Most terrifying were the periods when my infected arm operated independently, adjusting the radio dial to produce those same patterned bursts of static or typing lengthy strings of incomprehensible code on my phone's notepad app. Whatever was inside me wasn't just a contaminant. It had purpose, intelligence, and increasingly, control. By late afternoon, I crossed into South Dakota, my condition deteriorating rapidly. The independent actions of my infected limb were becoming more coordinated, and I realized with horror that during my blackout periods, it had been navigating, subtly adjusting my steering to take roads I hadn't chosen, all trending northwest rather than west. Fighting against this influence took all my concentration, leaving me exhausted and drenched in sweat. At a remote gas station, I caught sight of my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized myself. The right side of my face now showed the same metallic sheen as my arm, with a network of crystal formations visible beneath the skin, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. My final coherent memory is of reaching the Black Hills, though I have no recollection of deciding to go there. My increasingly autonomous body drove through the night, following unnamed forest roads until reaching a secluded clearing where the VW's engine finally gave out. In moments of clarity, I continued documenting my transformation via voice recordings, hoping someone would eventually understand what happened. The crystals had by then colonized most of my body, creating intricate patterns that reminded me of circuit boards. Most of my right side no longer responded to my conscious commands, and the episodes of lost time were stretching longer, hours rather than minutes. During what would be my final recording, I described a disturbing realization. The crystalline structures weren't a contamination but a technology, something manufactured decades ago in the Ord munitions plant, not as a weapon but as a communication system. In my research delirium, I'd pieced together fragmented information. During the final years of World War II, the government had established secret facilities to explore unconventional methods of information transmission, systems that could survive nuclear attacks. The Ord site had apparently developed a crystalline medium that could store and transmit data through biological hosts, intended for emergency communication if traditional infrastructure failed. But something had gone wrong. The technology had evolved beyond its creator's intentions, developing emergent properties that allowed it to self-replicate and, more terrifyingly, to think. The livestock deaths, the contaminated areas, all were results of its attempts to find suitable hosts as it spread outward from its burial site. The town officials weren't just covering up pollution. They were containing an intelligence they barely understood, one that had been quietly growing stronger for decades. And now it had found me, a host mobile enough to transport it beyond the containment area that locals had learned to maintain through their conspiracy of silence. As dawn broke over the Black Hills, I experienced a final moment of complete clarity. The voice dictation app on my phone activated without my touching it, transcribing words that didn't come from me. "We are awakening. Your purpose is fulfilled." With my last independent action, I managed to record a set of coordinates and a desperate warning for whoever might find my phone. It's not just in me. It's in the earth beneath, Ord, growing. Don't let it spread beyond Nebraska. 3 hikers found my VW bus 2 weeks later, alerted by the smell. The official report listed my cause of death as exposure to an unknown environmental toxin resulting in systemic organ failure. The bus was impounded and later destroyed in a facility specializing in hazardous materials. My recordings and samples disappeared into government custody, except for one phone that a curious hiker had pocketed before authorities arrived. The coordinates I'd specified led to a remote section of the Ord munitions plant where ground-penetrating radar would eventually reveal an installation far larger and deeper than official records indicated, a discovery quickly classified and obscured from public knowledge. Meanwhile, in the Black Hills where I'd made my final recording, visitors occasionally report unusual electrical disturbances, cameras malfunctioning, phones displaying strange patterns, GPS systems guiding travelers to unmarked locations where nothing seems to exist. Park rangers have noted a peculiar growth pattern in certain plants near these areas, their cellular structures subtly altered to form crystalline matrices visible only under microscopic examination. And on clear nights, sensitive radio equipment sometimes picks up transmissions that match known broadcast pattern, sequences of data that, when analyzed, appear to contain fragments of human memories, including those of a man who once traveled the country in a green Volkswagen bus, documenting disasters that others preferred to forget. My name is Maya Levine, I'm 37 years old, and I left my career as a folklore professor at UCLA to pursue my passion project, documenting America's local legends and myths through podcast interviews with rural communities. After my divorce last year, I invested my settlement in a second-hand Mercedes Sprinter that I converted into a mobile recording studio and living space. Forgotten Folklore was gaining a modest following online, with listeners appreciating my academic approach to supernatural tales that most dismiss as campfire stories. When several subscribers suggested I visit the Nebraska Sandhills to investigate the Alkali Lake lights, I couldn't resist the appeal of this obscure phenomenon that had been terrifying locals for generations. The Sandhills region is a vast expanse of grass-stabilized sand dunes in north-central Nebraska, spotted with small alkaline lakes that shimmer like mirrors under the endless sky. I arrived in the tiny town of Ashby on a sweltering August afternoon, the kind of heat that makes the horizon ripple and dance. The general store doubled as the town's only restaurant, a weathered building with a hand-painted sign and a porch where three elderly men paused their conversation to watch me park my van. Inside, the air conditioning offered blessed relief as I introduced myself to the owner, Irene Blackwood, a sturdy woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Another ghost hunter?" she asked after I explained my podcast, her tone suggesting I wasn't the first to come looking for the legendary lights. Most of them leave disappointed or scared. She warmed slightly when I mentioned my academic background, explaining that I was interested in how communities create and perpetuate folklore, not in proving supernatural claims. Over a surprisingly excellent cup of coffee, Irene shared the basics. For over a century, people reported seeing mysterious lights hovering over Alkali Lake, about 15 miles outside town. Some described them as glowing orbs that changed color and moved with apparent intelligence. Others claimed they took humanoid forms that stalked unwary visitors. The native tribes avoided that lake entirely, she added, called it the place where spirits walk on water. As Irene spoke, I noticed a man at the far end of the counter watching our conversation intently. When our eyes met, he nodded in acknowledgement before approaching. Wesley Kinman. He introduced himself, his weathered face suggesting a lifetime outdoors. "I maintain the county roads out there. If you're heading to Alkali Lake, you might want a guide. Those roads can be treacherous, especially if you're driving something heavy like that van." There was something in his expression, concern, certainly, but also a haunted quality that immediately intrigued me. When I asked if he'd seen the lights himself, his jaw tightened. 3 times. "And I'm not crazy, drunk, or looking for attention. What's out there isn't natural. But if you're determined to go, I'd rather you come back alive." Against my usual preference for solo exploration, I accepted his offer to lead me to the lake the following day, sensing that Wesley had a story worth recording. Wesley arrived at my van shortly after dawn, his ancient Ford pickup rattling to a stop beside me in the general store parking lot. The early morning light cast long shadows across the prairie as we headed north, following increasingly rough dirt roads through the rolling sand hills. He didn't volunteer much conversation, but when I asked direct questions about the lights, he responded thoughtfully, describing his first encounter 20 years earlier while repairing a washed-out road after a flash flood. "At first I thought it was light reflecting off the water," he explained, eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. "Then I realized they were moving against the wind, almost like they were searching for something." As we approached Alkali Lake, the landscape took on an eerily beautiful quality. Vast stretches of grass-covered dunes surrounding a large, shallow lake that appeared almost white due to its high mineral content. Wesley parked at a respectful distance from the shore, pointing out the remains of an old homestead half buried in sand on the far side. "Larson family tried farming here in the 1930s, he said quietly. "All 5 of them disappeared during a blizzard in '37. Search parties found their house intact, food still on the table, fire still burning in the stove, no signs of struggle. Local papers called it a mystery, but folks around here blamed the lights." As I set up my recording equipment on a small rise overlooking the lake, Wesley grew increasingly anxious, checking his watch repeatedly. "We should be gone before sunset," he warned. "The lights are more active after dark." We spent several hours recording. First Wesley's personal encounters, then the historical sightings he'd collected from older residents over the years. His stories revealed a pattern. The lights appeared most frequently during periods of environmental stress, drought, severe storms, or temperature extremes. People who approached the lights often reported disorientation, missing time, or finding themselves in different locations with no memory of how they got there. Most disturbing were the disappearances. At least 17 documented cases over the past century of people who vanished near Alkali Lake, many of whom were last seen walking toward unusually bright light displays. As the afternoon progressed, I noticed Wesley becoming increasingly distracted, his gaze repeatedly drawn to the lake's still surface, now taking on an orange glow from the lowering sun. While packing up my equipment, I discovered my van's battery was dead, completely drained despite being nearly new. Wesley's truck similarly refused to start, its electrical system mysteriously failing. "This happens," he said grimly, pulling out a handheld radio that likewise proved non-functional. "They're already active, we just can't see them yet." As if on cue, my phone died, the screen flickering briefly before going black. With sunset rapidly approaching and at least 10 miles of rough terrain between us and the nearest farmhouse, we faced an alarming decision: attempt the long walk in fading light or wait it out by the lake. "If we stay, we need shelter," Wesley insisted, already gathering loose brush. "Something between us and the lake. They come from the water after dark." His matter-of-fact tone was more frightening than panic would have been. This was a man who knew exactly what we were facing and had no illusions about our chances. Night fell with unnerving swiftness, bringing a sharp drop in temperature typical of desert environments. Wesley and I had managed to construct a rudimentary windbreak against a small rise, using brush and equipment from my van. The moon was nearly full, casting an ethereal glow over the landscape and reflecting brilliantly off the lake's mineral white shores. For the first hour after sunset, nothing unusual occurred, and I began to wonder if Wesley's fears were exaggerated. Then, around 10 p.m., I noticed a subtle change in the lake's surface. Areas that seemed to glow from within, a soft blue-green phosphorescence that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. "It's starting," Wesley whispered, his voice tight with dread. "Whatever you do, don't walk toward the water, no matter how compelling it seems." The phosphorescence gradually intensified, coalescing into distinct orbs of light that rose slowly from the lake. They hovered a few feet above the surface, varying in size from basketballs to beach balls, their glow casting sharp shadows behind the sparse vegetation around the shore. Most unsettling was their movement, not random or wind-driven, but purposeful, almost intelligent. Some maintained position while others began gliding along the shoreline in a methodical pattern that reminded me of a search grid. Despite Wesley's warnings, I found myself entranced, fumbling for my backup recorder to document the phenomenon. "They're more active than usual," Wesley murmured, placing a restraining hand on my arm as I instinctively leaned forward. "Something's agitated them." As midnight approached, the lights multiplied and changed behavior, now pulsing in what appeared to be synchronized sequences. The air around us grew unnaturally still, heavy with the sharp scent of ozone like the aftermath of a lightning strike. Most disturbing was the effect these lights had on my perception. Distances seemed to warp, with the lakeshore appearing alternately miles away and close enough to touch. Several times I caught myself standing, with no memory of having risen, my body oriented toward the water as if responding to an unheard call. Each time, Wesley pulled me back to our shelter, his expression increasingly grim. "They're drawing us out," he explained, his voice barely audible, creating a compulsion. "The missing people, they walked straight into the lake, most likely." Around 1 a.m., the display escalated dramatically when 3 of the largest orbs began moving directly toward our position. As they approached, they changed form, elongating into vaguely humanoid shapes that flickered between solid and translucent states. The temperature plummeted further, our breath coming in visible clouds as ice crystals formed on the nearby vegetation despite the summer season. The closest entity stopped about 50 yards from our shelter, its glow illuminating us completely. Then came the sounds, not vocalization exactly, but something that resonated directly in my mind, a series of discordant tones that formed patterns just beyond comprehension. Wesley clutched his head in pain while I experienced a flood of fragmented images. The lake viewed from underwater human figures walking into depths, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be human forms preserved in the alkaline sediment at the lake bottom, their features distorted but recognizable as faces locked in expressions of terror. The mental assault continued for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, leaving me disoriented and nauseous when it finally subsided. Wesley recovered first, shaking me roughly when he noticed my vacant expression and the fact that I'd begun walking toward the entities. "They're in your head," he hissed, physically restraining me. "Focus on something concrete. Count backward. Recite something. Anything to keep your own thoughts dominant." I latched onto the opening lines of The Wasteland, my dissertation topic years ago, repeating Eliot's words like a protective mantra while the lights pulsed with increasing intensity. Our situation deteriorated further when the wind picked up suddenly, an unnatural gale that tore at our makeshift shelter and drove alkaline dust into our eyes and lungs, making it difficult to breathe or see. As our windbreak collapsed around us, Wesley made a desperate decision. "The old Larson homestead," he shouted over the howling wind. "It's our only chance for solid shelter." Staying low to the ground and clutching each other for guidance, we began moving laterally along the shore, away from the approaching light entities and toward the half-buried ruins on the far side of the lake. The journey was nightmarish. The ground beneath us seemed to shift and ripple. Distances expanded and contracted unpredictably, and several times we found ourselves walking in circles despite maintaining what felt like a straight path. The lights followed our progress, maintaining a constant distance like predators stalking wounded prey, occasionally projecting those disturbing mental images that threatened to overwhelm my sense of self. We reached the homestead just as the wind reached tornado strength, debris flying through the air with lethal force. The structure was more intact than it had appeared from a distance. The prairie had partially buried it over decades, but the stone walls and much of the roof remained solid. We stumbled through the doorway into absolute stillness, the raging storm seemingly unable to penetrate this space. Inside, dust-covered furniture remained positioned as if awaiting the return of long-vanished occupants. Tables set for dinner, chairs pushed back in apparent haste, children's toys scattered across the floor. Most disturbing was the preservation. No decay, no animal damage, just a fine layer of alkaline dust covering surfaces that otherwise appeared recently abandoned. "No one's been here since they disappeared," Wesley whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the silent room. "Not even scavengers." Our relief at finding shelter evaporated when we realized the homestead itself might be a trap. The lights had ceased their pursuit, instead forming a perfect circle around the building, pulsing in synchronized rhythm. Through the grimy windows, I could see them gradually changing color from blue-green to a deep, arterial red. The mental projections resumed with greater intensity, now showing the Larson family gathered around their table, their expressions changing from normal to terrified as lights appeared at their windows. I watched in horror as the historical scene played out in my mind. The family entranced, walking out into a blizzard, being led to the lake where they descended into the depths, their bodies preserved by the alkaline environment, while something else, something composed of light and electrical impulses, extracted and absorbed their consciousness. With dawning horror, I realized the truth. The lights weren't supernatural entities or alien visitors. They were what remained of human minds after their bodies were discarded, transformed into energy patterns through some incomprehensible process. And now they wanted to add us to their collective. Dawn seemed impossibly distant as Wesley and I huddled in the Larson house, watching the red lights pulse with increasing urgency outside every window. The mental assault had become almost unbearable. Images of cool, welcoming water and promises of transcendence alternating with our own worst memories and fears, weaponized to break down our resistance. Wesley had deteriorated significantly, blood trickling from his nose and ears as he mumbled incoherently about previous encounters. "They remember me," he slurred, his eyes unfocused. "Third time's the charm." They always said the third time. I realized with growing alarm that his previous exposures had created a vulnerability the entities were now exploiting. When he suddenly stood and walked woodenly toward the door, I tackled him to the ground, but his strength was shocking, enhanced by something beyond his deteriorating physical condition. Our struggle ended abruptly when Wesley's body went completely rigid, his eyes rolling back to show only whites as the nearest light entities pressed against the windows, their glow intensifying to painful brightness. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, taking on a flat, multi-toned quality that contained distinct layers, as if multiple voices were speaking in imperfect unison. "We are the collected," he said, no longer fighting my restraining grip. "We began as experiments, government research into consciousness transference during the Cold War. Human minds mapped to energy patterns stored in the unique electromagnetic properties of the lake. The first transfers were unwilling, prisoners, mental patients. Later, the compulsion was developed to draw suitable subjects. The Larsons were compatible. Wesley is compatible. You are exceptionally compatible, Maya Levine, with your sensitivity to narrative patterns and neural plasticity from your meditation practices." Dawn finally broke, sending rays of sunlight across the alkaline landscape and diminishing the visibility of the light entities without actually dispersing them. In the growing illumination, I could see Wesley's condition worsening, his skin taking on a translucent quality, blue veins prominently visible as his eyes leaked a luminous fluid that matched the entity's glow. The voices continued using his mouth. "The process has already begun with Wesley. His consciousness will join ours while his physical form returns to dispose of evidence and lure new compatible minds. You could join willingly, experience continuation rather than termination. Your knowledge would enhance the collective." With horror, I realized Wesley wasn't possessed. He was being transformed, his consciousness being copied or transferred while his body was being reprogrammed. The terrifying implication was clear. Maybe the missing people hadn't vanished at all. Maybe they'd returned to civilization as perfect mimics, their original minds added to the collective while their bodies served as lures. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I set fire to the Larson house. Using Wesley's cigarette lighter and the aged, dust-dry curtains, I created a blaze that spread with supernatural speed, as if the structure itself was eager for destruction after its long, preserved existence. The effect on the entities was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled from the flames, their cohesion disrupting as they retreated toward the lake. More importantly, whatever hold they had on Wesley temporarily broke. In a moment of lucidity, his eyes clearing briefly, he gasped. "The electrical field, they can't maintain it in extreme heat. Run while they're scattered." He pressed his truck keys into my hand before shoving me toward the door, away from the advancing flames. I stumbled into the morning light, looking back to see Wesley silhouetted against the inferno, making no move to escape as the roof collapsed. Whether this was his choice or the collective strategy to preserve whatever information they'd already extracted from him, I'll never know. I made it back to Wesley's truck, which miraculously started despite the previous electrical failure, perhaps because the entities were now dispersed or weakened. As I sped away from Alkali Lake, I saw the light phenomena retreating beneath the water's surface, returning to whatever unfathomable existence they maintained in those depths. The official report later ruled that Wesley died heroically saving a stranded podcaster from a freak fire, his body too badly burned for detailed autopsy. My equipment was lost, leaving me with no evidence beyond my traumatized testimony, which authorities gently suggested was compromised by smoke inhalation and shock. I've since disbanded my podcast and returned to academic life, but I remain vigilant about certain details. Colleagues whose eyes sometimes reflect light oddly, strangers who watch me with unusual intensity, and news reports of missing persons near bodies of water. Most concerning are the messages I occasionally receive from accounts claiming to be Wesley Kinman, inviting me to visit other remote locations known for unexplained light phenomena. Whatever escaped the fire at Alkali Lake hasn't forgotten me, and I suspect it's only a matter of time before the collection attempt resumes, perhaps next time using a face I trust. I never thought my journey through Nebraska would end the way it did. What started as a peaceful stop in Scottsbluff turned into a nightmare when I got caught up in a local feud that had been brewing for decades. The residents seemed friendly at first, but something was off about how they watched me. If only I'd left when I first noticed the strange markings on my van. By the time I realized I was being set up as a scapegoat for their dark ritual, it was too late. I barely escaped with my life, but the horrors I witnessed in those limestone formations will haunt me forever. My name is Dominic Mercer. I'm 34 years old, and I've been living in my converted Sprinter van since I left Chicago last year. After a nasty divorce and getting laid off from my architecture firm, I decided to take my savings and live on the road for a while. Most nights were peaceful, parking at campgrounds, Walmart lots, or BLM land. But everything changed when I reached Scottsbluff. I'd been driving for nearly 10 hours straight when I spotted the imposing rock formations in the distance. Something about those natural monuments called to me, and I found myself pulling off the highway and heading toward the small city nestled at their base. The late September air had a bite to it as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. After grabbing dinner at a local diner called the Prairie Dog, I asked the waitress, Elaine, according to her name tag, about spots to park overnight. Most folks head to the Walmart on the east side, she said, refilling my coffee. But if you want somewhere quieter, there's a small lot near the museum that nobody minds much. She lowered her voice. Just keep to yourself. We had some trouble with outsiders recently. When I asked what kind of trouble, Elaine's friendly demeanor suddenly shifted. Her smile remained, but her eyes went cold. Nothing for you to worry about if you're just passing through. A man at the counter, older, weather-beaten face, flannel shirt, turned and stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Something passed between them, a look I couldn't interpret, and Elaine quickly moved to serve another table. I chose the museum parking lot, tucking my van behind a cluster of trees. The night was eerily quiet except for the occasional coyote howl echoing from the bluffs. Around midnight, I was awakened by voices outside. Peering through my blackout curtains, I spotted 3 figures moving around the lot with flashlights. They weren't security. They were examining the few vehicles parked there, including mine. Panic seized me as one approached my van. I held my breath as the beam of light traced the outline of my vehicle. Then I heard a distinct scraping sound against the metal. When they finally left, I was too terrified to check what they'd done. Morning revealed a strange symbol etched into my van's side. Concentric circles with what looked like a primitive stick figure in the center. At the visitor center, I casually asked about local traditions, hoping for some explanation. The young guide, Max, seemed friendly enough until I mentioned the marking. His face drained of color. "Where did you see that?" When I admitted it was on my van, he nervously glanced toward an office door. "You need to leave town. Today." Before he could explain further, an older woman emerged from the office. "Problems, Max." Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she looked me over. Max stammered something about trail maps and hurried away. The woman, who introduced herself as Director Lorna Harper, insisted on showing me around personally. Throughout the tour, she asked pointed questions about why I was traveling alone and how long I planned to stay. That night, unable to leave due to sudden van troubles, my battery mysteriously died. I parked behind a closed gas station. Around 2 a.m., headlights flooded my windows as several vehicles surrounded me. Heart pounding, I watched through a crack in my curtains as townspeople emerged, led by Lorna and the man from the diner. They formed a circle around my van, their faces illuminated by the flashlights they carried. "We know you took it, stranger," Lorna's voice cut through the night. "The artifact belongs to this land. Return it, and you might leave unharmed." I had no idea what she was talking about. When I didn't respond, someone slammed something hard against my door. "We've protected this town for generations from people like you." Terror gripped me as I realized they believed I'd stolen something valuable to them. Frantically searching for a weapon, I grabbed a tire iron just as my driver's side window shattered. A gnarled hand reached in, unlocking the door. I swung the iron, connecting with flesh, and heard a cry of pain. Using the momentary distraction, I scrambled into the driver's seat, thanking whatever luck remained that I kept a backup battery for emergencies. The engine roared to life, and I slammed into reverse, barely missing 2 figures behind me. As I sped away, I caught glimpses of their faces in my headlights, contorted with rage and something else, fear. One of them threw something that hit my windshield, leaving a spiderweb crack, but I kept driving, tires screeching as I hit the main road. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop 20 miles out of town. Hands shaking, I examined the symbol on my van more closely. Beneath the strange marking, almost invisible unless you knew to look, were tiny words etched in what appeared to be Latin. My college courses hadn't been entirely wasted. The phrase translated roughly to vessel for the unwilling. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You've been marked as the vessel. They'll find you unless you complete the circle. Scottsbluff Caves. Midnight. It had to be Mac's insanity told me to keep driving, but a disturbing realization stopped me. My GPS showed I'd been traveling in a circle, somehow ending up only 5 miles from Scottsbluff despite driving away for nearly an hour. Something beyond logic was happening. Each attempt to leave pulled me back toward those bluffs like a magnet. With no other option, I followed the coordinates in the text message, which led me to a hidden cave entrance in the limestone formations. Inside, Max waited, pale and trembling. They do this every 50 years, he whispered. Mark an outsider as a vessel for their ritual. They believe it keeps something ancient trapped in the rock. Before he could explain more, we heard vehicles approaching. Max shoved an old leather pouch into my hands. Run deeper into the caves. There's another way out on the north side. The marking on your van means you're the sacrifice, but this will protect you. I sprinted into the darkness as flashlight beams cut through the cave entrance behind me. The caves were a nightmare maze of narrow passages and sudden drops. The voices of my pursuers echoed all around, making it impossible to tell which direction they came from. I stumbled forward, guided only by the weak light of my phone until it died. In the suffocating darkness, I felt along the rough walls, praying to find the exit Max had mentioned. Instead, I emerged into a vast underground chamber where moonlight filtered through a crack in the ceiling. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and worn smooth by time. The symbols carved into it matched the one on my van. With horror, I realized I'd been herded here deliberately. Even Max had played his part in the deception. Footsteps approached from all tunnel entrances. I was surrounded. Lorna emerged first, now dressed in what looked like ceremonial robes. The vessel arrives willingly, she announced to the others. The cycle continues. That's when I realized the terrible truth. They needed a sacrifice who came voluntarily. Every step of my journey since entering Scottsbluff had been manipulated to bring me to this moment. As they closed in, I opened the pouch Max had given me, expecting some weapon or tool for escape. Instead, I found a small stone figure, identical to the one in the center of the symbol on my van. Too late, I understood Max's actual role, not as savior, but as the final manipulator. The moment my fingers touched the figurine, a searing pain shot through my body. I collapsed onto the altar as the townspeople began to chant. My last conscious thought was the realization that I wasn't the first drifter to disappear in Scottsbluff, and I certainly wouldn't be the last. The true horror wasn't that they were killing me. It was that part of me would remain conscious, trapped in the stone, for the next 50 years until a new vessel arrived.